You've done this once or twice. I think, okay, gosh. Hey, welcome everybody. You know me, but for the sake of our recording, we're streaming today. And are we all set with that, Steve? Wonderful, wonderful. So welcome everybody who's participating online and checking this out. First, I got to give you credit for, on a snowy afternoon, thinking, you know what I'd like to do is I'd like to go to a talk called "When is War a Crime?" But you know what? We need moral courage right now. Courage to go to uncomfortable places, ask uncomfortable questions, and to be part of uncomfortable conversations. That's part of why we have the second speaker series, where we're trying to equip Christians, and of course our whole community, to speak about these issues at what I call a higher level, or at least a more informed level. Right now, so much of the conversation around almost any issue is at the shoot from the hip level, just gut reaction, how do I feel about it? Well, today, we're going to be able to go a little bit deeper with that and learn some technical definitions of these words that get thrown around, and then also maybe even how to engage others in a better level conversation. Christians are called to be peacemakers. And it says, and Jesus says we'll be blessed to the extent that we are peacemakers. If we're going to do that, then we need to help lower the temperature. Doesn't mean that we don't, I'll mix metaphors, hold people's feet to the fire for wrongdoing and so on, yes, but also to be able to say, now let's look at these. These words have meaning, and let's try to understand that together. So to this end, we brought in Dermot Groome, who's one of the most humble rock stars I've ever met, and in the sense that he has been fighting for justice in places as diverse as Jamaica, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In Carlisle, he is raising up the next generation of international war crimes prosecutors, helping young lawyers have a passion for this. Dermot literally wrote the book on investigating war crimes. So if you want a manual on how to prosecute war crimes, collecting evidence and so on, you go to Dermot's book on this. So it's no exaggeration. You can Google him and you'll find out that that's kind of the definitive text, and it's one of the many things that he's known for. Where Dermot and I got together was through our sons. They were buddies back when they were both bubblers in Boiling Springs, and my son Andrew said, I think you'd like Ned's dad. The funny thing about it is, Andrew didn't know a whole lot, and Ned's dad is into politics too and likes to debate. I think he's a lawyer or something like that. And then, I didn't realize, oh my gosh, we're in different leagues entirely. But one of the things that Dermot and I have in common is, with many of you folks, is our appreciation of the local Bosnian community. So it was, in July, it'll be 3 years ago, we got together a big event called Genocide, Justice, and Hope. And it was in remembrance of the terrible massacres that happened in Srebrenica, and also the prosecution of Ratko Mladic. Dermot was instrumental in that prosecution, and there was a PBS documentary about it and so on. And when we were able to come together for that, and Dermot was just relating an anecdote of hearing just 2 nights ago the impact that event made on the local Bosnian community. We had over 700 people participated. It was just an amazing outpouring of emotion. And one of the moments that I'll always remember was when, I believe it was you, Dermot, asked the crowd how many people they had lost in the war, and to indicate with their fingers, And I think it was somebody said, I do not have enough fingers, and all these people around us. But suddenly those losses mattered. And Dermot at that time was the face of the superhero in if this were a Marvel comic, of the one who brought the perpetrators to justice. It did not bring back the dead to life. It didn't do that. But at least made the survivors feel seen and feel that there was hope and that there was someone on their side. So it's in that spirit of saying, hey, how can we stand up for justice and bring people hope? We can't always stop evildoers, but we can at least fight for justice in different ways. One of the things Dermot asked me to do is, we're going to talk about a lot of things, and he'll kind of know where the boundaries are, but there are two situations that are on everybody's minds right now, Israel and Hamas, and Ukraine and Russia, for which it is possible that Dermot may end up, this is me talking now, may end up involved in the prosecution of those cases, depending upon what ends up happening. So he's going to be limited in his ability to share specific information about those situations, but we can ask questions about analogous situations, definitions, all kinds of things. So just don't be surprised. Say, well, I can't talk about that particular situation, but let me describe what happened in Cambodia. Or, in fact, one of the things I just discovered today is Dermot took his war crime thinking and began to apply it to domestic situations. One in particular, the church sexual abuse cases. To what extent does that kind of thinking apply in prosecution of those situations, which, horrific, and I just printed that off to read that article. One question that I raise that's close to Second Church's heart is, gosh, what the support that we provided, good intentioned support to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, to what extent could that have been classified as cultural genocide? If that happened today, are there laws that, international laws that prevent that, and that kind of thing? But it helps us to understand a little bit more, even as these words are just getting thrown all around. Anything we don't like is a war crime, and so, so today we're asking, when is war a crime? And then I thought to myself, well, when is war not a crime? Certainly it's a terrible thing, but that will be part of the mix too. Let's pray. God, we thank you for Dermot and for each person here. Even though we're small in numbers right now, maybe even our stream is multiplying the presence, but we don't know. We do ask that each one of us would become a peacemaker in our own situation, and that this conversation would enlighten and edify and build us up so we can be peacemakers in Carlisle. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, Dermot Groome.
Thanks, Jeff, for the generous introduction. I'll leave a check in your mailbox on the way out. I actually have a connection to Second Presbyterian that predates meeting Jeff. So I moved here with my family initially for a year in 2005, and my son started school downstairs in your nursery school and had a great experience there. So let me just say a couple of things before I start. So welcome, and I very much appreciate you coming out, and I'm sure when you left your house you saw that snow squall. Maybe Steve, could you maybe put up my presentation? While he's doing that, so I'm going to give you an overview of international criminal law, and with some specific information about Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine. I'm not going to offer my legal opinion. It's my hope that at the end of today, you'll have the information you need to form a more informed opinion for yourself about what you're seeing in the news, and also maybe have more informed discussions about it. I'm basically taking an entire semester's course and trying to condense it, so I've tried to do it in a way that I don't overwhelm you, But I certainly welcome you to raise your hand and ask questions. If there's any point along here that you would like me to explain more, and we can do this in a very conversational way. Whenever I start my course at the law school here in town, I ask students how many atrocity crimes can they name that occurred in their lifetime. And I think the record has been like 4. So what I usually start out with is just, and I'm not going to speak during this, but I'm just going to play the atrocities that have happened in our world since 1998. And I'm sure when you see them, you'll say, oh, I forgot about that one, I forgot about that one. But I think it's good to ground ourselves in that we as a species don't have a really good record for treating each other very well. So let me do that now. Are you able to see that from there? Can you see it? Yeah. So I guess I should read it then. So the first one is 1998 to present, Colombia. There's been a long-standing conflict there with the FARC. Also in 1998, the Democratic Republic of Congo claimed thousands of lives. We have obviously the conflict in Afghanistan since 2001. Uganda since 2002, the Lord's Resistance Army and James Coney, who cites Bible verse as the justification for some of the terrible crimes he's committed. 2003 to the present, Darfur. Kenya, there was election violence, 2007, 2008. 2008, Georgia. 2009, Sri Lanka. In the spring of 2009, 30 to 70,000 civilians, women, children, disappeared. Just in the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, Tamil civilians. No one's ever been brought to justice. No one's ever even investigated it. 2009, Guinea. 2010 to 2011, Côte d'Ivoire. Libya in 2011, I'm sure you'll remember that. Mali in 2012, this is where those ancient religious structures holding sacred texts in Timbuktu were all destroyed. 2011, Syria, terrible, terrible crimes there, still going on, and no one brought to justice. 2012, Boko Haram, Nigeria. 2013, Central African Republic, CAR. Violence between Muslims and Christians. 2014, so Ukraine's in the news a lot this year since the invasion on February 24th, 22, but it actually started in 2014. And if you remember back then, there was actually a commercial jet flying from Amsterdam to Malaysia that was hit with a missile, and I think it was 230 people, heading for holidays, died. Palestine and Israel, we'll talk about that again, but it traces its way itself. The conflict traces its roots to 1947. 2014, the genocide against the Yazidi people, a textbook case of genocide. All the men killed, all the women turned into slaves and married off to ISIS fighters. 2014, the fighting that we began with the Houthi rebels in Saudi Arabia, but that's in the news as well now. They're attacking shipping lanes. Okay, we have the oppression and possibly a genocide being committed against the Uyghurs, the Muslim population in northwest China. In 2016, the Myanmar government began a genocide against the Rohingya minority people there. And then on February 24th, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. And then, of course, the most recent events, October 17th, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas launched a large-scale attack into Israel, killing and raping and committing all sorts of terrible acts. And shortly after that, Israel launched a large-scale response on Gaza, which is still ongoing. Okay, so you see, we've never really had a period of time where we haven't had atrocity crimes. So again, my hope is that I can give you some basic information about what the law says about this, and then we can discuss if you have any questions. So there are really 5 main types of international crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, apartheid, and aggression. Okay, and I'll talk about each of them in turn. The way I encourage my students to think about these crimes is to think about, let's say, a murder that would happen in any community in the world. The elements, what has to be shown for that murder to be proved in court, is that someone intentionally caused the death of another human being. And that's pretty much the same in international law as well. What elevates that murder to an international crime is the presence of other elements, which we call context elements, or sometimes we call them chapeau elements, the French word for hat. They kind of sit on top of the elements, and that's what elevates that murder to an international crime. So I have a war crime there. So the contextual element of a war crime is that the murder is connected to an armed conflict, okay? For genocide, that murder, the context is that murder is part of an effort to destroy in whole or in part a protected group of people. So it's destruction of the group. And then a crime against humanity, that's when the murder is part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. Doesn't matter what their religion or ethnicity is, it's an attack against that civilian population. Now, if we were to trace the roots of where does this all start, we find ourselves in the cultural texts. Well, I guess you're definitely not going to be able to read that, but I have some passages from the Quran, from the Code of Manu in India, and a war manual in China. And so we have this kind of touch points in our ancient cultural texts that recognize that we should show humanity, even the context of fighting and war and attempting to conquer another group, that we should show mercy when we succeed, we should treat prisoners humanely. Okay? So that's where it kind of starts. Okay? And we have some references in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well that kind of encourage humane treatment. Unfortunately, we also have some, particularly in the Old Testament, some references that suggest inhumane treatment of persons. Okay? So had I known, I would have made my font really much bigger. I'm not going to go through all of the history. I've given Jeff a handout of all of these slides, and at the last slide, I have resources, links to resources. Again, I'm not going to tell you what to think, and I'm not even going to express my opinion, but hopefully I'm giving you the links that if you are interested, if you want to follow these extremely important cases that are now have commenced, you can do that. So you'll be able to read all of this when you get that from Jeff. But there are a lot of historical junctures that we could talk about, and I would talk about in class, but I'm just going to confine myself to a few. And one of the first points is Henry Dunant. He's the person who established the International Committee of the Red Cross. So it was in 1859 that there was this battle in northern Italy, the Battle of Solferino, and you can see it's marked there. And it was a vicious, vicious battle. And Henry Dunant was based in Geneva at the time, and him and some other people went to the battle after it had ended. And what really troubled him and struck him and affected him profoundly was he looked out at the battlefield, and there were these soldiers that were seriously wounded and left to die slowly in terrible pain, animals, eating them, some of them alive. And he was so troubled by this that 3 years later he wrote this book about his observations. And in that book, there's a copy, a photo of the book, and it was called Memories of Solferino. And in that book, he challenged the international community. He goes, can't we do better than this? Can we not agree that once the battle is over, can we not bury the dead? Can we not find those who are injured and give them the aid that they need? Can we not notify the families? So he began this movement. This was well received in Europe, and it culminated in the first Geneva Convention in 1864. That was the first attempt, very rudimentary, very bare bones, to try to address the horrors of war, recognizing that we weren't going to figure out how to avoid war, but maybe we can figure out how to ameliorate some of its terrible consequences. Now, one thing we can be very proud of as Americans, so that's 1864, is that around the same time we had our own American Civil War, so 1861 to 1865. And for all the brilliant and visionary things that Abraham Lincoln did, a lot of people don't realize this. He thought that the whole purpose of this war is that I reunite the country, that we once again live together as brothers and sisters, as Americans. And Lincoln thought it's only going to be really hard to do that if there are atrocities in the war and if we have the kinds of things that we see happening over at Solferino. So he commissioned this person, Francis Lieber. He was a German lawyer. And he said, can you please write a code that I can issue as an order to the Union troops? And I'll just show you a couple of passages from it. This code was issued in 1863. So this predates the Geneva Conventions. And it was issued to all Union soldiers. And I'm just going to read you 2 bits of it. Hopefully you can read that. But the 15 in this code, men who take arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God. So even in this act of war, we have this responsibility, this moral responsibility. And then the second one, it talks about what is permissible, but just that last line. In general, military necessity does not include any act of hostility which makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult. Okay? So a real, very important document in the history of the laws of war. Okay? The next big juncture, I'm skipping over World War I and a few things, but is Nuremberg. Okay, this is our first effort to really hold people accountable for war crimes that they committed. I'm going to let you read that while I just get a sip of water. Now we'll talk about some of the crimes that were prosecuted in Nuremberg, but 2 really dramatic things, and it's Article 7 and Article 8. Prior to this, there was, and there still is, sovereign immunity, but the sovereign of our country was immune from any kind of prosecution for any crime, okay? Article 7 says no, okay? In Nuremberg, immunity, there is no immunity for the sovereign. The sovereign can be as responsible, criminally responsible for crimes if they have committed them. And Article 8, there used to be this idea that, well, if I'm only obeying orders, if I'm told to kill a civilian or whatever it may be, as long as I'm doing it pursuant to an order from my superior, I'm off the hook. And this again says no. You are not allowed to obey an illegal order. It can be taken into consideration for your punishment, okay? And one thing we can be very proud of as Americans is that our military has an affirmative duty. If a soldier receives what he recognizes or she recognizes as an illegal order, even if it's from a general, they have an affirmative duty, and if they don't do it, they're punished, of bringing that to the attention of other superiors. Okay, so we really have this built-in kind of whistleblower part that prevents that. After Nuremberg, the next big event in international criminal law is the court that I was a prosecutor in. So there are 2 of the 5 prosecutions I did. That's Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, up on the left. So I indicted him for genocide, first sitting head of state indicted for genocide. He died 4 weeks before the trial ended. And then my last trial is Ratko Mladic, the general who ordered 7,000 to 8,000 men and boys killed in Srebrenica, and I convicted him of genocide for that, okay? Around the same time, we have the ICTR. We saw, on the news every night, the terrible things happening in Rwanda, and the Hutus were killing, committing a genocide against Tutsis. So that was around the same time. Both my court and the ICTR was established by the UN Security Council. It was the first time they did that, and I won't get into the legal basis for it because it's complicated, but it showed the motivation or the resolve of the Security Council to address atrocity crimes. Now we can't get a tribunal for Syria, for Myanmar. It's very hard to get the Security Council to do anything, in this regard at this moment, okay? So now let me begin to talk to you a bit about war crimes, okay? So war crimes are a bit different than the other crimes we'll talk about, in that war crimes, are you able to read that? I don't want to, okay. War crimes very often are marked by indiscipline. So in the heat of battle, a soldier loses his or her comrade, they overreact, they go a little bit, lose the control of themselves, and they commit crimes, okay? That's a typical war crime, although there are many others. But so it's a different character than genocide and crimes against humanity, which are carefully thought out, carefully calculated. But this is kind of what we have. And again, just to return to where this comes from, so I grew up in New York City, and when I think back on it, even from first or second grade, there'd be schoolyard fights. And I don't know who taught us this, we never had a class in it, but there were rules that applied to that fight. You couldn't kick someone when they were on the ground, you couldn't pick up stones or sticks, you couldn't pull hair, you couldn't poke someone in the eye, you couldn't hit a girl. I don't know where it came from. Is it, just innate in us that we have this knowledge? Well, if we look, there are corollaries to that in law now, okay? So you must, after someone surrenders, you have to treat them humanely. There are restrictions on the type of weapons that can be used. You can't use mustard gas or blinding lasers. You can't have unnecessary injuries, and there's a protection of certain classes of people, such as medical personnel and chaplains and things like that. So that's kind of where this springs from. War crimes, there are these 3 main principles, and I'll talk about the last. But all of the crimes, there are hundreds of individual war crimes, they address these different principles. The first one is the principle of distinction. In war, it is never permissible to intentionally target a civilian, okay? You cannot target a civilian, okay? Having said that, if there's a military object with civilians adjacent, you can target the military objective. You cannot intentionally target the civilian objective, but you're bound by the principle of proportionality. So you have to choose a weapon, you have to choose a means to achieve your military objective, but minimize the collateral damage to the civilians. That's the principle of proportionality. Then the third one, principle of precaution. If it's feasible, if you can tell those civilians we're about to attack, we're telling you so you can get out of there or you can, do something, okay? And then the last one is that once someone surrenders or they become injured, they are no longer a combatant, and they have to be treated humanely. So if you remember those three principles, though, you kind of know the basics of war crimes, okay? Distinction, no, you can never target a civilian. Proportionality, if there's a chance civilians can be harmed, you have to find a method least with the least risk of harming them, and then precaution, you need to warn them. My team were the first ones into Belgrade after NATO bombed it. And when I went there, I talked to some of the people who lived through the bombing, and I asked them, was it a terrible time to be there? And I said, yeah, it was terrible, but they had great confidence in US munitions and NATO munitions, that they were accurate and that they were proportional. And they felt that if they stayed where they if they stayed where they were, that they had confidence that the NATO munitions, they'd be safe from them. And I could see that myself. So there was one place, it was the Ministry of the Interior building in a city block with other office buildings, and NATO had put a bomb right down the middle of it. It destroyed all the offices in there, but there was very little damage to the other buildings except for the glass. I'll just wait for...
Dermot, what about in the Bible? I can't cite chapter verse, but there's some kind of prohibition about, like, you're not allowed to cut down the olive trees of the enemy. You're not supposed to salt the earth of the enemy, like to prevent them from being able to grow crops. Are those kinds of behaviors covered in this too?
Yes.
So those are against some law?
Yeah, I'll show you there's prohibitions against environmental damage and that. And I'll show you the principles here. Unfortunately, I don't know if you followed, I think it's Amalek, one of the, I think it was the president of Israel actually made a reference to Amalek. And is it the book of Amalek, or is it just a reference? Or
it was a command by God to wipe out the Amalekites and everybody.
Children, women.
Animals, everything.
Yeah. So, yeah. So that's the main principles. Remember I talked about those context elements. For war crimes, it's an armed conflict, and there has to be a connection to the armed conflict. So if you think about it, there is domestic crime all of the time. People rob each other, people kill each other, they get mad with their neighbor, you have all this kind of stuff. That continues even in the face of an armed conflict. So the nexus requirement is that it's not an ordinary crime happening during an armed conflict, it's somehow connected to the armed conflict, okay? So once an armed conflict begins, and the way the laws of war have been interpreted is to try to give the most protection to civilians as possible. So an armed conflict can begin simply with a reconnaissance team crossing the border into another country, okay? Even though no shots are fired, that would be the beginning of an armed conflict. And that flips the switch for all these protections. These hundreds of protections are now in play, okay? So it's easy to turn on, it's hard to turn off. So it only turns off when there's a permanent peace. So the fact that there might be a ceasefire doesn't turn off those protections, they still exist. It has to be this durable, permanent peace before that switch of these protections come off. Geographically, same idea. It's not just where the battle is, it's in the whole country. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in 22, that switch went on, and the laws of war apply everywhere in Russia, everywhere in Ukraine. There are parts of Western Ukraine that have not been impacted, but then there are parts of Russia that obviously have not been impacted. But the laws of war apply everywhere. So those children that have been taken from Ukraine and dispersed around Russia, they're still under the protection of the laws of war. Okay? So now we have 4 Geneva Conventions. I'm just going to touch very lightly on them. But the Geneva Conventions cover all sorts of things. So to give you an example, with the one that applies to prisoners of war, when a person is taken prisoner, within a specified time period, I think it's 2 weeks, they have to be allowed to communicate with their family. They have to be allowed to send a letter home or some way of telling their family that they're okay. A violation of that is a violation of the Geneva Conventions, but it's not a crime. For it to be a crime, it has to be a grave breach, which is in Article 50. So you probably hear this term, grave breaches. So it's murder, rape, willfully causing great suffering. It's the more serious ones. Those are the ones that have criminal liability. So the 4 Geneva Conventions, the first one deals civilians and military personnel who are wounded, sick, or no longer engaged in hostilities. The second Geneva Convention, members of armed forces who are wounded, sick, or shipwrecked at sea. The third, members of the armed force who become prisoners of war. And the fourth Geneva Convention, if an area is occupied, taken and occupied, the fourth Geneva Convention applies. Okay? So this is relevant in the context of Gaza and the West Bank. The consensus in the international community is that they're occupied territories and that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies in those areas. Okay? In each of these Geneva Conventions, there's the same text in Article 3. It's common Article 3. And this is the baseline protection to everyone. Okay? There are some provisions that would waive certain protections. These protections cannot be waived. They're always in existence. Okay? So now I'm going to go over some of the other ones that you need to know about and are very relevant for your, for trying to make sense out of what's happening in Israel and Gaza and in Ukraine. So the International Committee of the Red Cross maintains a database, and it has enumerated all of the laws of war. And I have the link there, so when you get the handout, you can go click, and I encourage you, it's very accessible, very easy to understand. You can just peruse all the protections. It's organized very well. Hospital and safety zones, they get special enhanced protection, okay? Medical personnel, they have special enhanced protections. So when I talked about that issue of proportionality, special rules apply to a hospital. Hospitals cannot be attacked except in very special circumstances, namely when it's being used to mount attacks out of the hospital. But even in that case, every effort has to be made to protect those patients, protect the doctors, and that, okay? Here are some related to civilians in conflict, in armed conflict. If you are a belligerent force and you are going to have a military objective, let's say the US Army decided to put something next to this building, they would have an obligation to try to get us out of here, get us out of harm's way, okay? That's an affirmative obligation. So again, when we think about Hamas, putting command centers near these, very sensitive and vulnerable civilian objects, this rule would say, that shouldn't be done. Hostage taking should never be done. It's a violation. And human shields should never be done. Okay? It's a violation. Okay? And by the way, all of this is a matter of customary international law. So we can trace this. And if you go to the website, if you're interested in where did this start, where did it come from, the website will trace it all the way back as far as they can go to all of the cases, where it was first articulated and that. Okay? I think I jumped over one. Yeah. So humanitarian relief. Okay? Again, personnel that are engaged in humanitarian relief have special protections. Okay? And I'm going to read this one because it's really important. Access for humanitarian relief to civilians in need. The parties to the conflict must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, which is impartial in character and conducted without any adverse distinction, subject to their right of control. Cultural and religious property is protected. Okay? You can't blow up religious houses of worship or cultural institutions unless they're being used for military purposes. And then to go back to what Jeff was talking about, you have to safeguard the environment. So in Ukraine, so I actually spent the summer in Kyiv, Ukraine, training the prosecutors there. And when I was there, the Kavaka Dam was blown, this massive dam, and it just sent a wall of water down. And I've been working with two retired EPA investigators, and I didn't appreciate this. So the wall of water created enormous damage to livestock, to farmland. But when you have a reservoir that was near industrial facilities, over the decades, heavy metals and poisons kind of settle down in the sediment, and they're kind of okay. They're safe enough there, or safe as they can be. When that dam was blown, all of that stuff now was just washed down and is just covered all over the fields. Okay.
How can you legally detonate a nuclear warhead and not cause environmental damage?
Yeah, I mean, nuclear weapons are a case in of themselves. And actually, when I talk about the ICJ, I think it was, I'm trying to think when the decision came out, but they basically said what you said. They took 300 pages to say it, though, about nuclear weapons, you know, that can they really ever be used? But we have them now, we hear they may be going into space, which is quite troubling. Okay, so that's war crimes. Any questions about war crimes before I move to crimes against humanity? Okay, so again, this is different. Crimes against humanity are like an intentional, more carefully thought out crime. So just a brief history, I'm leaving out lots of steps, but in the 1814 Treaty of Ghent, people prohibited slavery and recognized that enslavement was a crime against all humans. So the idea is that the crime is so serious, it's not just a crime against the poor people that are enslaved, but it's also a crime where we're all victims because we all have a shared humanity, and it's a crime against all of us, okay? The first use of the word crime against humanity was by an African-American lawyer, George Washington Williams. Now, at the time, this is after the Civil War, he was very active in trying to help former slaves find new lives and join the economy and be prosperous. And he heard about these great things happening in the Congo, and particularly King Leopold II had written some books and stuff about all these great things that were happening. So he decided that he was going to go there and learn from what was happening in the Congo. And when he got there, he was absolutely horrified. People's hands were cut off as punishment. They were walking around in chains. It was just the most horrible treatment you could ever imagine. And it was him that coined the word, this is a crime against humanity. What I have seen in the Congo is a crime against humanity. And now the historical consensus is that King Leopold II was a war criminal for his treatment of the people, the Congolese, okay? This is from Nuremberg. This is the London Charter that created Nuremberg post-World War II, and there we have the first official definition of a crime against humanity. It was developed by a man by the name of Hersch Lauterpacht, who went to the law school in Lviv, presently Ukraine. And the interesting historical fact is the father of genocide, who I'll tell you about in a couple of minutes, Raphael Lemkin, also went to that law faculty. So that law school has a lot to be proud of. Okay? So just to give you a sense of what a crime against humanity looks like, I'm going to tell you one that I prosecuted. So that's basically an aerial view of Sarajevo. The area within the red is the town and was held by the Bosnian government. The area outside the red was held by the Serbs throughout the war. And you can see it's very precipitous. The mountains just rise up. So this is in the city, and you can see all the mountains all around. And around those mountains, they had these artillery pieces. And what Mladic would do, what he was convicted for, is causing terror as a crime against humanity. He would just sporadically have his men fire into the city. You know, it wasn't a military objective. It was just to attack the people, make them scared all the time, kill some of them. And so that's what a crime against humanity. It's an attack on a civilian population. It's either widespread or systematic. And there are different variations of it. You can have killing, you can have, terror or whatever it might be. Okay? Just to make the point is that it doesn't have to be a violent attack. Let me try on one foot. So, have you heard about the Nuremberg laws? So before World War II, before the Holocaust was full-blown and concentration camps and extermination centers were set up, the Nazis passed a set of laws called the Nuremberg laws. And they did different things, like if you were a Jew and you were a lawyer, you were automatically disbarred. If you were Jewish and you worked for the government, civil servant, you were immediately fired. So it was this kind of discriminatory treatment, depriving them of the ability to work, the ability to live their lives. That is an attack. No violence, but it was an attack on a civilian population. Okay? So what we have going on now in Gaza is Israel has the right to defend itself. Okay? No one disputes that. So how, if you're going to assess whether there is also a crime against humanity being committed against the Palestinians, the Kunerat's judgment, court case, said the way you do it is to use the laws of war, what I just told you about, as a benchmark. So we look at what the laws of war permit, and if there's anything that's excessive that is not permissible under the laws of war, we can examine that and determine whether there's an attack, a crime against humanity or a genocide. So we use the laws of war in a situation where there's a conflict as a measure to figure out if there are other crimes are being committed. Okay? I just have one up there, murder. Okay? Now genocide. Still with me, or? Very depressing stuff, I know. Genocides probably have been happening throughout human history. The first one in the 20th century is against the Herero and Nama people. German colonial settlers decided that they wanted the land of these two tribal peoples in what is present-day Namibia, and just decided to kill them all. Kill the women, kill the children, kill the people, took their land. There was some scientists doing eugenics in Germany as a prelude to what happened a few years later. So they took their skulls, de-skinned them, and used them to do so-called scientific experiments. The next one is what happened to the Armenians. Okay? This happens in the context of the end of World War I, and the Ottoman leaders decided they didn't want Armenians in their country. So they killed the leaders, killed many just ordinary Armenians, and they pushed them into the Syrian desert, the desert that's now Syria, without any possibility of what they needed to sustain life, and many of them died there. So that's one way of committing genocide, placing people under conditions that cannot sustain life. The American ambassador, Henry Morgenthau, was there at the time, and he is reporting on this, and he says, look, this is not just about killing lots of Armenians. And he uses the term, it appears a campaign of race extermination is in progress. This is really about trying to exterminate a race of people. Just a historical digression for a second. Henry Morgenthau Sr. was the ambassador to Turkey. He made these very important observations. His son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was the Secretary of the Treasury for the United States. And if you go around and check post offices, you'll very often see his name on the cornerstone. He used Treasury law. When the Holocaust started, we didn't really, as a country, we didn't really want to bring in Jewish refugees. And Henry Morgenthau figured out a way to use some of the Treasury law to help Jewish refugees that were escaping with their lives enter our country. Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s son, Robert Morgenthau, was my boss when I started my career at the Manhattan DA's office. So it's a family that really has contributed an awful lot to American society. Okay? Now, when we say genocide, everyone immediately thinks of the Holocaust. But what some people don't realize is no one was ever convicted of genocide in Nuremberg. And that's because the crime did not exist then. Okay? We owe the establishment of the crime to Raphael Lemkin. He was born in 1900. And so he was a teenager when the Armenian genocide was happening. And it really bothered him that, you know, here was this trying to wipe out an entire race of people. Murder just wasn't good enough for that. You know, this wasn't like 1,000 murders. That just didn't reflect what was happening. We needed a crime that reflected this, okay? And the other thing that bothered him is that the only people who could prosecute whatever was happening in Turkey would be the Turks. That's not going to happen. So he said, we need a law, we need an international law that recognizes the gravity of what genocide is and also is international in nature, that any country would have the jurisdiction to be able to investigate and prosecute that crime. He coined the term genocide, so genos for tribe or race in Greek, and chide from the Latin to kill, so to kill a race. So we have the General Assembly in 1946 adopted a definition, set up a commission to study it, to see if we could articulate a specific crime. And in 1948, the Genocide Convention was passed. Okay, and that's just the preamble. I'll give you a second to read that. But it's recognizing the odiousness of genocide as a crime. What is the crime? Okay, you can just go to Article 2. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. This is where I usually pause in my class and ask students, I won't call on anyone, law school you do, who is the victim in genocide? And people will say, well, you know, it was the Jews in Holocaust. I mean, it was, you know, the thousands of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, or it was, you know, the hundreds of people of the Yazidi women. It's not. We have murder for that. We have murder as a crime against humanity. Genocide, the victim is the group. And that's the way we need to think about genocide. It's the physical destruction of the group. Okay? Now, Lemkin had proposed that we have a separate crime called cultural genocide. That never made it through the negotiation process. So there is no such thing as cultural genocide as a crime. Having said that, cultural genocide is extremely important in proving that the group was targeted for physical destruction. In my work in Yugoslavia, where genocide occurred, not only were the people killed and whoever survived fled, but the mosques were leveled, turned into parking lots, the Islamic libraries were leveled, all to make sure that there was nothing to come back to. So that cultural destruction is very relevant in the crime of genocide itself. Okay, those are the different ways you can commit genocide, and I'm going to take a water break. And maybe if I'll just point out, one of the claims of South Africa is if you look at Article 3C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. So if someone was inciting genocide, that would be a crime. But the Genocide Convention does more than just name the crime or define the crime. All the countries that signed it, it's one of the most, if not the most, widely adopted convention or treaty, is that, look, we're going to take affirmative steps to prevent genocide. So one of the claims that South Africa has made is that a number of leaders, political leaders in Israel, have made statements, like with the Amalek and with other statements, that might be interpreted as being insightful, that Israel hasn't investigated and hasn't held them to account for doing that. So that's one of the claims. When we think of genocide, we have to recognize that it has a second meaning. So I've told you the legal definition, but genocide is kind of thrown around very loosely for any atrocity crime. And the reason it is because we promised ourselves that we would never let another genocide happen after the Holocaust. So it's become this way of trying to prompt a reaction, an intervention. And what I have down there, you can't read it now, but you can read it when you get the handout, is so during the Clinton administration, all of the press people were specifically instructed not to use the word genocide when they were talking about Rwanda. I mean, they now have it in the documents. Do not use the word genocide. Why? Because if they were on the nightly news saying there's a genocide in Rwanda, ergo, the U.S. has to get involved, and the U.S. didn't want to get involved directly in Rwanda. Okay, so it has that kind of powerful political power as well. And as lawyers, we have to separate out that from the very precise definition of what a genocide is. Okay, and there I've just broken it out. It has to be intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And we call this the specific intent of genocide. Having done this, I'm one of the few people that has prosecuted genocide. I've won and I've lost. So I know the difficulties. I kind of know where the line that separates the two. Yes, sure.
You said if it were really genocide, then the United States would have to get involved?
I mean, I think politically, there's been a lot of political pressure to have sent troops to Rwanda because, again, we promised that we would never let another genocide happen, as did other countries.
So you say we promised we would never let another genocide. Do you mean the United States promised?
The international community.
Right. So it wouldn't necessarily be the United States that would have to get involved if the word genocide were used.
No, and we don't now. So I'm just using that as an example to show the kind of political power that the word has. Now, I don't think it still has that, because now we can talk about the genocide against the Rohingya, genocide against the Uyghurs, genocide against the Yazidi woman. No one feels any pressure to do anything, right? So that's all dissipated, unfortunately. So, okay. So this slide is just, genocide, as it did in the Holocaust, starts out with persecutory crimes, the discriminatory treatment of the Jewish population, and then evolves into a full-blown genocide. Okay? Just to point out that the Genocide Convention was written in 1948. It doesn't protect people because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, political affiliation, or their social group. So I can imagine at some point people may say, well, do we need to update the Genocide Convention to give those same group protections to other groups? Any questions about genocide? Okay, so I have two more crimes to give you. These will be very short. Apartheid, we know that from South Africa. This is the definition that's in the Rome Statute of the ICC. And in its simplest form, apartheid is setting up two legal regimes, one for one group and a separate one for another group. And it's discriminatory. Okay, so we all know the history of South Africa. There are some that say that Israel has an apartheid state or apartheid practices in the West Bank and Gaza. What they use as evidence of that, there are a number of things, but the simplest example is if you have a settler, let's say there are two boys, they're 15 years old each, and they throw stones at each other. Okay? And the IDF gets involved and arrests the two boys. Okay? The Israeli boy, the settler, would go to their juvenile justice system and would have all sorts of protections, limited detention, parents called, lawyer. The 15-year-old Palestinian boy doesn't get that. He goes to the military justice system. He's treated like an adult, can be held indefinitely. And observers say, well, that's two different systems for the same act or same law that was broken. So that's the crime of apartheid. And the crime of aggression probably is more relevant in the context of Ukraine at the moment. And it's essentially that someone with the capacity to order troops or order violent acts, aggressive acts, does so against another country in violation of the UN Charter. Okay? One of the things the UN Charter did was that we were ending the ability for a country to take land by force. So if you if you cross into another country with an aggressive act, that's called aggression. Okay, so how do we enforce this? I'm just going to getting near the end. Thank you for bearing with me. So how do we enforce this? I'm going to talk about the ones that are most relevant now. We have the International Court of Justice. This is in The Hague. There's the beautiful building built by Andrew Carnegie. And this is part of the this is the UN court. And this is where states can sue other states. So if there's a border dispute, if there's any kind of dispute between states, they can bring it here. They also do another kind and they also have jurisdiction over genocide. And that's how South Africa brought its case here against Israel. They also can issue advisory opinions. So the Security Council or the General Assembly can say, look, we have a legal question, can you please give us an advisory opinion? And they've done that. They've done it with the nuclear weapons, and they've done it with a number of things. And I'll talk about two of them here. Okay, so in terms of Ukraine versus Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it did so saying that Ukraine was committing genocide, and that's why it was justified in going into Ukraine. So it used the Genocide Convention to justify its aggressive act. Ukraine brought that before the ICJ, and just on the 2nd of February, the ICJ ruled that that case could go forward. It could examine the merits of that, and on the 16th of March, it ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations. Okay? The South Africa versus Israel on the 29th of December last year, South Africa filed a complaint against Israel in the ICJ, alleging that Israel was violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention in 9 different ways. On the 11th and 12th of January, the court had hearings. Israel presented its arguments, South Africa presented its arguments, and then on the 26th of January, the court ordered provisional measures. It did not order a ceasefire, but it did order Israel to ensure that it was complying with the Genocide Convention and that it required Israel, I think it's a monthly report that they have to file to show how they're doing this. One of the interesting things about that decision was the Israeli judge on the court actually voted in favor of imposing 2 of the measures against Israel. One was the giving humanitarian aid, and the other is to clamp down on these political leaders that were saying insightful things. So that was a surprise to many of us. Okay, 2 other advisory opinions that the ICJ is doing in relation to Palestine. In 2004, it issued a decision on the wall. Israel, after the Second Intifada, Israel built a wall to protect itself. That wall went into the West Bank and cut off Palestinians from their farms and that. They issued an opinion saying that the wall was illegal, but they have no way of enforcing anything, so nothing really came of that. And then in December 2022, the General Assembly asked for another advisory opinion on the occupied territories, the nature of the territories. This Monday, the court is starting 15 days of hearings about this. 55 countries are going to show up in The Hague and over the course of 2 weeks present their arguments, and then the court will give its advisory opinion to the General Assembly about the legal implications of occupied territory lasting so long. Typically, under Fourth Geneva Convention, occupied territory is something very brief. It happens and then, things get sorted out and they withdraw. I mean, the West Bank and Gaza now have been occupied for quite some time. Okay? So that's state responsibility. That's state, not individual responsibility. The other court that is working on this is the International Criminal Court. This is individual criminal responsibility. Okay? So again, so on March 2nd, the prosecutor opened an investigation into the situation in Ukraine. On the 17th of March, 2023, he issued an arrest warrant for Putin and this woman, Belova, and it was they've taken thousands and thousands of children from their homes in eastern Ukraine and sent them out. They've changed their names, they've given them passports, they've adopted them out, and that's a violation of several violations of international law. There's an investigation that's continuing into other possible crimes in Ukraine. Situation in Palestine, there's a long kind of tortured history about this, but right now, I'll let you read this for yourself, but there's an investigation, and there has been an investigation since 2021, okay? And so the court is looking at individual criminal liability for what's happening in Palestine and Israel, and it's looking at, it can indict people on both sides. It's not just, a claim against one. So it's our hope that the court will do its job well, and that it will, whoever has committed crimes will be held to account. There are victims on both sides, that whoever has been victimized by a violation of international law, they'll get justice in the court. Okay? So I just want to finish up with, why do we do this? This costs a lot of money. I guess one of the things I struggle with is living here. My students really, we don't really care that much about it. We distract ourselves with Netflix and with all these other things while, people are dying right now on these terrible deaths. Hostages are still, there, away from their families and fear for their lives. Why do we do it? And the answer to why we do it was given by Justice Robert Jackson, a member of our Supreme Court, who was sent over to be the chief prosecutor in Nuremberg. And in the second line of his opening statement, he tells us why. And I'll read it to you, so you probably can't read it. It says we have to do it. We have to have these trials. We have to do international justice because civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. So he phrases it as an existential issue, that if we don't make sure that there's justice, even if we're not directly impacted, that it's an existential threat to all of us. And you can imagine the way things are going. I've given my life to the law, so I believe the way out of this terrible situation we're in now is the law. Let's hold the people that are breaking the law accountable. Let's get justice for the victims who have, been harmed by violations of the law. And I think that's the way out of it. And that's what he recognized there. If you'll indulge me for one more slide, I think there's a very important lesson that I think we also need to learn from this. That man there that I've just put the circle around his head is Hermann Goering, the architect of the Holocaust. Now, when they were doing Nuremberg, they wanted to keep these guys healthy. They didn't want them to, get sick or die during the trial. They also wanted them to be psychologically healthy. So they were all assigned psychologists as well. And he was assigned an American soldier who was a psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, who talked with him on a daily basis. And at one point, they got where they could talk about just about anything. Dr. Gilbert said to him, "How did you get Germans to go along with this stuff? They were pretty decent people. How did you get them to do this?" And Goering's answer, I think, is an important lesson for all of us, particularly as we're moving into an election cycle. And I hope that we heed it. I'll show you what Goering said. There we go. I'll read it to you. I'll read the whole thing so you can't see. Goering says, "It's always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or communist dictatorship. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism." And I believe the important lesson there is that when people tell us we need to be afraid of this one or we need to be afraid of other Americans, an alarm bell should go off, and we should be saying, is someone trying to manipulate me, or really am I under threat? So anyway, I'll leave it there. I have a last slide with all the clickable links that you can, anything that I've talked about, you can go there if you want to follow it, learn more about it. Just go ahead. So thank you for your attention and coming out such an yesterday. Yeah, questions, yeah.
Questions, because you might have application questions that you want to go over. This is a great opportunity if you do. Mark? Mark's got one, and then we'll go back.
I have a lot, but I'm just going to ask this one. The UN.
Tilt the mic toward you.
The UN has a Security Council which Russia is on, right? Is there any rules in taking countries off if they're disobeying these wars against humanity and so on?
I mean, the short answer is I think the UN is broken. I mean, the UN froze the power structures at the end of World War II. Russia is not violating any rule. Nor is China when they veto. Under Article 7, or Chapter 7, the Security Council is responsible for peace and security in the world. It's their job to keep the world safe and secure. What happens when one of the countries responsible for that has invaded another sovereign country? It's broken. And I don't know what the fix is. People are saying, well, should we get more power to the General Assembly? Should we rethink the Security Council? But we all know no one gives up power. Russia's never going to agree to give up that power, nor will China, nor will the U.S., right? We wouldn't agree to having a rethink about the power structure that would give us less power, right? So it's just not in human nature. If you have other questions, or whatever, I'm not rushing anywhere.
I'm amazed in my lifetime at the violence that I've seen and the evil that exists in the world, humans towards each other. You said earlier, you're hopeful that maybe based on law, we can fix some of the problems. I'm convinced that at least 100 million people have died in the last century. You're close to this. Are you hopeful for humanity?
I worry. I have kids that are young adults, but if I can maybe just, so I'm a person of faith, I'm a Christian. If when I die and go to heaven, if God will let me cross-examine him, I have a really good cross-examination worked out. Because I don't understand why, I just can't make sense of that. How so many horrible, horrible things can happen. But one thing that I have learned in my work is that as bad as some of the crimes that I've investigated, and this is kind of like how I cope with, people ask me, how do you do this stuff on a day-to-day basis? I always look, and I've always found it, an act of selflessness, an act of self-sacrifice that kind of transcends, at least on an individual level. I'll give you one story. A woman by Zara Turyachinin, Muslim woman. This terrible guy, Milan Lukic, one of my trials, on 2 occasions took 60 groups, 60 people, 2 times, mostly women and children, put them in houses and burnt them alive. She was put in with her family, and she had her younger sister who had Down syndrome. They were put in the house. They were all burnt alive. She felt she had to try to warn other women. She was able to crawl out through a window. All of her clothing was burnt off. She was burnt all over her body. She went to the town. Her eyes were swelling up. She had difficulty seeing. She went and she warned every woman she could. And when she could no longer really see straight enough to navigate, she found her way back to the soldiers and asked them to shoot her because she was in so much pain. They didn't because they're so cruel. An elderly couple took her into hid her in the attic. She had maggots in her wounds. She, was in terrible state, but after about 2 weeks, she then was able to cross out of the confrontation area, across the confrontation line, get to Sarajevo, because she felt that the world needed to know. And when I think of, that really horrible thing, I don't know how to explain it. I can't justify it to 60. But it was an opportunity for her to do one of the things that for me is inspiring and one of the most heroic, self-sacrificing things. And I guess that's how I kind of make sense of it. I look for opportunities with all of this. And there are lots of opportunities where we can be more generous with each other, kinder with each other. We can help each other more. And that kind of helps me deal with this stuff on a daily basis. So. Any other questions?
Yes. Do you think Putin will ever come to justice, will face justice?
So I get this a lot. People say, oh, what's the point? We'll never get him. We'll never get him. I'll tell you what I say to them. When I was investigating Slobodan Milosevic, he was the sitting president of Serbia. And everyone said to me, you'll never get him, you'll never get him. And I kind of believed them. And I said, okay, we're going to do our jobs well. We're going to leave a proper historical record with the evidence, so at least history can record what happened. And then, the dynamics changed in Belgrade, and his support kind of fractured, and my arrest warrant was the thing, well, let's get him out of here. And we got him. So, yeah, it is my hope that at some point, and maybe it'll be with Navalny's death, that his support begins to fracture, and there's an arrest warrant sitting out there for him that people will get him on a plane to The Hague.
I
think of the question that you've asked is kind of what is the point, and can we stop this? Can we bring some of the perpetrators to justice? And what you've said and what we've experienced is that we can do certain things, but the end result is beyond our control. You know, the actual verdict, and, you know, does the person die right before the verdict comes in, that kind of thing. But I think of how important it is that to the victims that we continue to bear witness that there is justice, that there is truth, that their suffering mattered. You know, that even if we can't bring people fully to justice, I think it matters that there are people in the world like Dermot, and hopefully like this group, that says right matters. You know, we can't right every wrong, but it still matters, and we won't stop saying that. You know, and then when we get to heaven and Dermot's there to cross-examine God, I want to be there for that, by the way. I want God to be able to say, like, thank you for not giving up. You know, just vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Justice is ultimately God's. It's not ours to do. But if we don't stand up for justice, then how are we different in our own way than the people who just stood idly by while people were being rushed off to the concentration camps? You know, at some point, we may not be able to stop it, but I think we can do our part. And Dermot, thank you for doing your part. Yeah. Thank you for training that next group of young people, because we need that. We need more people who understand these concepts and can turn general morality into specific morality. It's very relevant for our time. So thank you so much. Let's show our appreciation to Dermot for coming today. And you have those handouts? Did you give them to me?
I didn't print them out. I sent you an email.
I will get them. Don't leave. I'll go to the printer right now.
Or if you have people's email, because they won't be able to, you know, they'll have the clickable link if you want to just send it as an email.
Can I do that for you? Because I have everybody. We'll get Kathy's email, and then we'll be able. Okay, good. So be
and then this way you have access to everything.
Yes.
So, and can I just say one other thing? I mean, I'm sure some of you must know this, but you know, one of the first Bosnian refugees to come to this area was Mercida, and she was welcomed by your community here. And you know, I've gotten to know
Merceda's European market. Yep.
And I've gotten to know the Bosnian community pretty well, and I kind of said, well, why did 400 families come here? And they said, you know, word trickled out that Carlisle was a welcoming, supportive place. So they had originally gone to South Carolina and found a little hostile reception there, and they kind of moved away. So I think that reflects very well on us as a community, that we have been understanding and supportive of people who have suffered so much. So.
Absolutely. I think that goes in the category of better to light one candle than curse the darkness.
Yeah.
We couldn't save all of Bosnia, but in a sense, Carlisle saved one family, and that led to 400 families, you know, finding a home. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay,
Dermot. Really appreciate it.
Have a good weekend, everyone.